The smell of burning leaves always makes me think of this story. It happened in the neighborhood I grew up in. It was deep into the fall when only a few leaves were left on the trees, and all the yards were covered in shades of yellow, red, and amber. My neighbor Pete was raking up his backyard. It was a good day for it, dry and cool and not too windy. The yard was big with a high wooden fence all around and two large elms towering over it. Pete would play a game with his son Elliot, who was about 4 or 5. He would rake up a leaf pile while Elliot hid behind a tree or the shed. When it was big enough, Pete would turn his back and start another. Elliot would rush from his hiding spot and jump into the pile, scattering the leaves all over, laughing. Pete would pretend to be mad and make a fuss and chase Elliot around with the rake. Then he would start another pile while Elliot found a new hiding spot, and they would do the same thing all over again. This went on for a while, and sometimes Pete would roll around in the leaves with his son, both laughing. Around the time the sun dipped behind the neighboring house, throwing a long shadow over the yard, Pete was growing tired of the game and told Elliot this would be the last one. Pete worked quick, feeling how rapidly the temperature dropped once the sun was low. He raked together a huge pile right in the middle of the yard and turned his back. He could hear Elliot giggling as he bounded toward the pile, and the sound of the splash into the leaves that sent them into the air. Then it went silent, with only a muffled exclamation from Elliot. Pete's first instinct was Elliot hit the ground too hard and got the wind knocked out of him. He rushed to check on him, but couldn't see him in the pile of leaves. Pete brushed the leaves aside, assuming his son was covered up. His hands found only the grass beneath. He scattered the remains of the pile out and looked puzzled. Elliot was gone. Pete stood dumbfounded. He used his foot to even out the last bit of leaves, even though there was no way Elliot could be under it. Panic hit him, and he looked around the yard, thinking someone must have come in and grabbed Elliot. He dropped the rake and rushed around, checking behind the trees and the shed. The world spun as he twisted in circles, looking for any sign. He called out Elliot's name, telling him to come out if he was hiding, but there was no sign of his son. Pete rushed to the nearest gate and out. He looked up and down the street. There was no one there. Pete hurried back into the yard and made straight for the gate at the back of the fence. He burst through into a small, overgrown strip of grass between his house and the neighbors behind him. He rushed along between the fences, but found no sign of Elliot. Pete staggered back into his own yard, calling louder for Elliot. Melanie, his wife, came out the back door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. A hollow look on her husband's face chilled her blood. Pete stammered out the story, saying that Elliot had been right there and then suddenly disappeared. Confused, she asked over and over what he meant, but Pete couldn't explain it any better. Panic overwhelmed them both, and they searched frantically one more time around the yard and all around their house and the neighbors. But Elliot was nowhere to be found. The sun had almost set, and time had taken on that strange quality for the couple where the moments seemed disconnected and floating and not real any longer. Pete found himself staring at the patch of grass where the leaf pile had been. He stamped his foot and got only the muffled reply of solid earth. Melanie looked at him perplexed. He didn't hear her the first time she asked if they should call the police. She had to shout to break him out of his fugue. Melanie gave up and dialed 911 on her phone. Pete just continued staring at the grass as she asked for an officer to be sent. It was complete dark when the police arrived, and Pete found himself on the couch in the living room trying his best to explain what happened. Melanie would chime in from time to time when Pete's account seemed to wander into the bizarre. The police conducted a thorough search of the neighborhood and came up with nothing. Melanie saw them off and came back inside to find Pete at the back window, just staring into the moonlit yard. He refused to leave the window, like he was puzzling something out. Melanie lay on the couch, mentally and emotionally drained. Pete didn't even notice that she had drifted off. Then, like a switch being flipped, Pete went into the backyard and raked all the leaves into a giant pile in the same place as earlier. He grabbed his flashlight from the garage, hid himself behind the shed, and watched. The moon was almost full, filling the backyard with a silvery light, making it possible for him to see the outline of the leaf pile among the inky shadows cast by the large elms. Pete had no idea how long he was there before he heard a neighbor's dog barking from a nearby house. It was muffled but intense. Pete heard the rustling of leaves. He listened close to make sure it just wasn't the wind blowing through them, but the night was calm and still. The rustling grew louder as the leaves cascaded down the pile. A strange, jagged figure emerged, wiry limbs pulling it upwards as if emerging from the earth itself. It was only a shadow in the moonlight until Pete flicked on the flashlight. What he saw shook him to his bones. He gasped and dropped the flashlight. He heard the leaves rustling violently as he snatched the flashlight and shone it on the pile, but the creature had disappeared. Pete dove onto the pile, digging into the leaves and scattering them about. Underneath he found only earth. His screams woke Melanie and brought her rushing to the backyard. She couldn't get an explanation out of him. He pushed past her and got a shovel from the shed and began digging. He dug all through the night until sunlight broke over the horizon. Pete had excavated the entire backyard before he was taken away and put under observation. When the doctors asked him what the creature looked like, he said it had glowing orange eyes like the flames of a jack-o'-lantern. It had arms and legs like a person but no hands. The arms and legs tapered out like the limbs of a tree. Its skin was the texture of petrified wood and shimmered with all the colors of autumn. The ends of the arms and legs were stained a dark red, and Pete didn't know if it was from the red clay earth or if it was the blood of his missing son. Even though he'd only seen it for a moment, every detail was seared into his mind. No one ever believed his story, even Melanie. It was assumed that Pete had hurt Elliot himself and concocted the story to cover up, but there was no evidence to convict him, so the mystery of what happened to Elliot was never solved. I think about that story every time the leaves change and fall.